Spurrier. I am a member of the board for MMBBA, and I'm also the chair for the Young Mortgage Professionals Committee. So thank you, Scott Story, for making the introduction to Marty Stanton so we could do this great event today. I think this is going to be a lot of really great information that our realtors may ask us, things we may come across, and we want to make sure, obviously, we're disclosing correctly and we know where to look for things. So a little bit about Marty. He's the Chief Operating Officer at KVS Title. He actually was a mortgage banker as well as now being a title attorney. So he has about 25 years experience between the two. So he really knows what he's talking about. He was born and raised in the Washington metropolitan area. He went to Gonzaga for high school, Fordham for his bachelor's degree, and then attended American University's College of Law for law school. So he's admitted into the Maryland State Bar, the Virginia State Bar, and also the District of Columbia Bar. So he's done a lot of commercial and a lot of residential real estate transactions over the years. And he's part of a lot of different affiliations. He's helped significantly with GCAR and writing their contract, and as well as the Virginia area. So he's very familiar with how these things work. So thank you again very much, Marty, for joining us, and I will let you take the floor.
Hey, thanks, Kate. I appreciate it. And I see some faces on the screens that are like, oh, I remember him back in the day on the mortgage banker side of stuff and things like that. I actually am so glad and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you because my mortgage banking background, there is no doubt, has helped me as an attorney in the title business. A lot of the systems that we've created as a company are around the fact of what you all have to do in order to make the loan approval process successful. So just know that I'm a recovering mortgage banker, and I'm looking forward to sharing with all of you the updates. It's interesting. The biggest one, and this is obviously most important for all of you, the Maryland realtors for a long time had done nothing with their contract, okay? They did that for a lot of different reasons, but last year they said, we're going to appoint a task force, a smaller group that's a little more nimble, if you will, to really look at our contract and look at a bunch of our important contingencies and address those. And so just a few days ago, October 1st, all of these form changes went live. So I'm going to spend the majority of my time today speaking to those things. But as it relates to you all as mortgage bankers, I won't take you through all of the changes, just what I think is really important for all of you to know. When I'm done with MR, I'll then stop for some questions, and then I'll go into GCAR and NVAR and how they work, just so that everyone here just has a complete understanding of where financing is from a contractual perspective, okay? And obviously, I'm open to any other questions that you may have, but I'll dive into MR first. And what I've done here is I'm highlighting the provisions that I want you all to focus on as mortgage bankers. If any of you want all of the things, I'm happy to give you all of the changes, but I'm trying to make it, concise for you all here. I want to let you know what the task force was trying to do was, first and foremost, they were trying to reorganize. They really felt like they were just adding paragraphs of the contract all over the place. And so I think they did a great job regarding that. They also wanted to address the as-isness of the contract. We're not going to spend a lot of time on we won't talk about the as-is addendum and things like that because I don't think it matters to you. But a big part of that was they're the first association that has removed the wood-destroying insect paragraph from the main contract and has now made it a separate contingency that's negotiable. And that's a huge change. And it will be interesting to see what GCAR and NVAR do as a result of this. They wanted to make the contract shorter. They didn't make it any shorter, okay? They failed there. But I think they actually did. And the other thing that they really wanted to address, the two things, is the property inspections. The way that they deal with that now is totally different. And then also they want to address the first-time Maryland home buyer and the split of transfer and recordation taxes, which they did a really nice job of as well there. So I'm going to speak to all of that. But the first thing that I wanted to cover is they decided, rather than as a header, as you're going to see with GCAR and NVAR, they decided to make the times of the essence paragraph a part of the contract. And that's critically important from a legal standpoint. What that means is that all of our dates are drop dead dates. If you don't miss that date, you're in breach or you're in default. So when you guys are setting up your systems on when a loan needs to be approved, when you need to do, when an appraisal contingency is up, you need to know that these dates just don't automatically extend. They are firm dates that need to be met. And so you need to meet those dates. And I know I often say, back in the day, I said, I'm only as good as the last loan that I did. I'm really now only as good as the last settlement that I've done and the experience that everyone had. You guys need to know that these dates are critically important in order to be successful. So I just wanted to point that out because that was a new change. Computation of days, because we're talking about days. MR actually has a provision in here regarding how days work. And essentially, days work if we ratify a contract today, which means we sign off an initial on it. You're going to see at the end of the contract, it says date of acceptance. Date of acceptance is when that last person initial off and signs the contract. But in order to have complete formation of the contract, that needs to be delivered to the other party. So they're aware of the fact that obviously we have a ratified contract. So what I suggest in the best business practice is if my client initials off and signs the last thing, they should send that the same day. And in MR, Maryland Realtors, they have up to 11/59/59 in order to do that delivery. That's the time frame for all of the contingencies and everything else in MR. So deliver the same day. If they were to deliver it the following day, then it's once delivery takes place that you have ratification. But I think more often than not, most people are delivering it the same day. And because they have all the way up to 11/59/59, it tends to get done. So you all can use the contract acceptance date as the first day, if you will, and all the contingencies start the day following. Now, the next provision that I really like is, look, they put your section, your main section, all in section 2. This is where you all are going to turn to the contract and say, okay, what do I got here? They've ratified the contract. I'm now doing the loan. Here's the information that I need to be concerned about. And the most important paragraphs for you are all aligned right here. And so the reorganization of the contract is great because these things used to be all over the place. Now they're all in one section. And the reason why I highlighted this isn't new language, but I see loan officers make a mistake regarding certain provisions in here, and I wanted to point this out to you. So it says that the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is their ability to obtain a written commitment for the loan secured. And then you're going to have conventional, FHA, VA, whatever the financing is here, right? You're going to have your applicable addenda like the gift funds contingency addendum and things like that. You then need to look at, because the definition isn't necessarily all the information isn't in the addendum. The financing application and commitment, these dates are right here, and they're hard dates. It gives the seller the option, if the buyer doesn't deliver essentially the commitment, the seller at their election can give notice to the buyer that they're voiding the contract. Most sellers tend not to do this, and in this shifting market, probably they're not going to, but it's something where this is another point. Great loan officers are going to recognize the fact that they have to meet this date in order to deal with the financing application and commitment. Buyer responsibility is that they haven't misrepresented their financing, that they're diligently going to pursue the financing as stated up above and in the respective contingency. So it's really important that you all recognize the fact that they need to apply for the specified financing that's in the contract. Oftentimes I've found that loan officers are like, oh, I got an even better program. Since you've done this, we have this option. Well, if you go down to paragraph 23 and you look at alternate financing, it says in MR, provided buyer timely and diligently pursues the financing described in the financing paragraph, the financing application and commitment paragraph, and the buyer responsibility paragraph, buyer at buyer's election may also apply for alternate financing. And so what that means in MR land is, if your buyer, let's just say that they decide to do conventional financing with 20% down, and you're all like, we got this great second trust program and we're going to do an 80-10-10. All right. I can see Alex Jaffe's just like, hey, Marty still knows his things. Okay. What I'm saying is they've now applied for alternate financing. They would be obligated to, if they were going to keep their financing contingency in place, they have to apply for both the 20% down, the 80% financing, and the 80-10-10. If they just go 80-10-10, they actually have removed their contingency. So you all as lenders need to recognize the fact that I can't just switch them into a different product. I need to either A, have them do an addendum because we have a better financing contingency in order to keep that in place, or the buyers need to recognize the fact that they have to make 2 applications. And I know most of you probably don't want to do 2 applications and run that through underwriting. So just recognize the fact that this is an MR dual application process in order for the buyer to essentially seek alternate financing. All right, the next section that I want to point out here is the inspection contingency, because this has changed a great deal, and I'm going to talk about it a lot in just a few minutes. But you can see here, this is where essentially the buyers are going to either, accept that they're going to have one or decline it, and you're going to have an addendum to the contract. If there's no addendum, there's no contingency. Just scrolling through to get to the next section. All right, and then I'm going to go through that contingency in a second, but look at the transfer charges. This is awesome, all right? And I even, what they decided to do, they checked with counsel, and the forms committee decided that we no longer have to show the statute in the contract. So they modified it where whether or not you have a first-time buyer or not, the default is transfer and recordation taxes are split equally, okay? And that only if you want it to be different than 50-50 are you going to put an amount in the line, and you're going to change that, okay? Now, I know I've taught this to literally hundreds of agents. I know they're still going to write in that blank line 50-50 because they can't leave a blank line there. But if you look at what it says payment of recordation taxes and local transfer taxes will be divided equally between buyer and seller unless otherwise stated here. So the default on both scenarios is that. And remember, under the statute in Maryland, if the contract were silent regarding transfer and recordation taxes, the seller agrees to pay all of them. And so what this change and putting this in the main body of the contract, it's retired the first-time Maryland homebuyer addendum. You're never going to see that again. This is addressed right here. And so I just wanted to point that out to everybody. That's where you go. And the default's the default, which makes sense. Okay. Conventional financing, I didn't include FHA and VA here just because for simplicity's sake, I want you to all know that paragraph 1 is where the specified financing is defined. So if you're looking at this in the contract and you know that you're changing any of these material terms, then the question is whether or not your client is applying for alternate financing or not. Now, if the rates improved, that's fine. But if we're changing amortization or term or the loan amount, okay, or even the loan program, that's going to be alternate financing, and you guys need to be aware of it. If the buyer wants the protection of the contingency, they need to dual apply for the loans, or they need to get the seller to execute an addendum allowing them to change the financing. And then I want to point out this appraisal contingency provision that's been added. None of the verbiage has changed except for this last provision that I highlighted. And it says, because there's a negotiation period of buyer and seller, it says buyer's failure to provide written notice to the seller of their election within the agreed upon timeframe will automatically constitute the buyer's agreement to elect to purchase the property at the purchase price in accordance with option B in this subparagraph. So what that's saying is they were addressing the issue for buyer's failure to provide notice to the seller. The buyer essentially is saying, okay, I'm moving forward, and whatever the delta is between the appraisal and the sales price, I'm paying for in cash. Okay, so that's an important change because it never addressed the buyer's failure to respond before. VA financing, because the wood destroying insect paragraphs have been removed from the main paragraph, you can see now it's being included here in paragraph 5. The other thing that I would point out is VA regulations have changed, allowing now the buyer to pay for the inspection fee and to pay for repairs. And there's also the link there that you can see regarding that regulation, which I believe changed in June, if memory serves me correctly. But that's now there, and that's why they added it for that. So then the next big change for everybody on MR is the property inspections addendum. And I highlighted wood destroying insects here. In Maryland, it's a little bit different with the Maryland Realtors contract. The buyer and seller actually negotiate each and every inspection that the buyer wants, whereas GCAR and NVAR just have a broad inspections addendum, and the buyer gets to inspect whatever they want during that time frame. MR is very specific regarding that here. And so essentially these things will all be initialed. If the buyer wants a wood destroying insect inspection, and it's a requirement in order to get the loan, for example, they need to ask for it, and the seller needs to agree to it. And then it's a freely negotiable item now. It used to be that if there was need for treatment or if there was damage that was done, the seller was on the hook for up to 2% of the purchase price in order to make those repairs or do that treatment. They are no longer on the hook for anything. This is a freely negotiable contingency, just like the home inspection, which really is normally referred to as the structural and mechanical inspection. So I wanted you to see that. But the big term changes are how they deal with this. So they redid this because there were two forms that they had before. There was an as-is inspection addendum, and there was just a general inspection addendum. The general inspection addendum did not give the buyer the right to void the contract unless the seller and the buyer awkwardly initialed the box. It was 4B in the contract. And that was really problematic because I would look at a lot of contracts, the buyer in their offer would initial that they wanted the right to void, the seller would not initial, and we didn't have a ratified contract, okay? The other reason why they did this is the as-is addendum they wanted to get rid of because it was not being used in the proper sense in the market that was so competitive. Buyers are just like, I'm just going to use the as-is property inspection addendum and either accept it or declare it void. And that's not what it was intended for. It's really intended for bank foreclosures and things like that. So they retired both of those forms. And now you can see up at the top, the buyer has the absolute right to terminate the contract unilaterally. So as prior to the deadline, okay, which is back on page 1, they can just send a unilateral notice voiding the contract. They get back their earnest money deposit, done. If they start to negotiate, they also have the right to negotiate. Then they need to deliver a copy of the home inspection report with a list of items that they need to repair. By the way, if they terminate the contract, they do not deliver the home inspection report to the seller. They just send the unilateral notice voiding the contract along with a release agreement for them to get back their EMD. But the right to negotiate, the buyer sends that with the list of repairs or the request for a credit. And then essentially the seller has 5 days to respond to that. If the seller responds with a negotiation, they do that. If the seller fails to respond, the buyer either accepts the property as is or voids the contract. Assuming the seller, if the seller says, I'll do all the repairs or I'll give you the credit that you want, the contingency is removed and the contract just moves forward. The seller offers a counter, like let's say the buyer asks for 5 things, seller says, I'm going to do 3 things. Then there's the start of the negotiation, which you can see is in section 4, additional negotiations, where either party can go back and forth every 2 days regarding negotiation. That's very similar to GCAR. GCAR's is just every 3 days. This is 2 days. But the interesting point is it says in 4 at the bottom, the failure of the receiving party to timely respond to any counteroffer shall constitute their automatic acceptance of that counteroffer with all other terms of the contract remaining in full force and effect. So if the seller, let's say the buyer asks for 5, the seller says 3, and then the buyer fails to respond within the 2 days, then the buyer's only getting the 3 and they're moving forward with the contract. Okay. It also has a provision in here that if they agree to a seller credit, then they're going to use an addendum to the contract that describes the credit as a credit towards closing costs that would be acceptable to the lender. Okay, so you guys should not see any of this negotiation back and forth. You're just going to see if there's a negotiated credit, that the credit's going to be towards closing costs. And that takes us through MR. So Kate, what I might do is just open it up for questions now, and then I'll move on to GCAR.
Okay, great. Sounds perfect.
Are there questions in the chat or anything like that?
Hey, Marty, how are you?
Hey, great. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing well. So question for you. I don't envision this being a big deal moving forward, but there's, over the course of the last couple of years, agents have used escalation clauses to their advantage. And sometimes they would write in figures that were way higher than what a buyer was really willing to escalate to for first right of refusal purposes. Do the changes in the contract kind of prevent that in any sort of way?
You know, great question, Scott. And you're right. They did not address the escalation clause. It wasn't on their radar screen to do that. But I will, and sometimes I think the market's going to control that a little bit. Between you and me, first of all, not as many people are writing offers. And MR, one of the things that they have, and I think this is why a lot of agents use this, they're very similar to GCAR, that if the seller uses the escalation in order to raise the purchase price, essentially it's a counter offer to the buyer and the buyer has to agree to it. And so they essentially can be lofty because ultimately the buyer is going to have the right to take a look at it and see if they want to perform anyway, and they can void the contract. So I think that that's why that protection's in there. It's interesting because in Virginia, it's totally different. In Virginia, it's binding. So in Virginia, you don't have seller buyers. They have to want to go escalate to that. I think if MR were ever to change where it was binding, I think you would see control measures come down and buyers only be willing to offer a certain price. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes complete sense. And then Tim Whittier has a question in regards to termites.
Yeah.
So say you, I guess, negotiated a termite inspection on VA loan, and the termite comes back and there is past evidence of termites, nothing serious, or maybe they recommend treatment, right? Would the buyer be able to utilize that as a way to get out of the contract?
What they would do, and I'm just going to scroll back up real quick. And I didn't cover it on it just from the interest in timing. They can use it here in paragraph 6 under lender required repairs, and that because you have the wood destroying insect inspection, and they would be able to use that to negotiate. The seller isn't obligated to make the repairs, but they certainly could use that as a negotiation. And if the seller wasn't willing to pay them and the buyer didn't want to take care of them, ultimately the buyer would be able to void the contract because the lender required repairs were not being met. Does that make sense?
Yep. And would that hold true on a conventional loan where they had negotiated a wood destroying insect inspection?
Yes, it would. If you look here, there's also a provision. Hold on one second. There's also paragraph 6, lender required repairs as well. So you would just want to make sure that that's made as a lender requirement in order to deal with it.
Got it. So if a seller is willing to do the treatment, would the buyer still be able to void the contract based on evidence of termites?
No, if so, the inspection, the inspection now is going to be negotiated back and forth. So let's just go under this addendum. The buyer is going to ask for essentially the repairs. They would have the right to terminate the contract. Each inspection, so let's say we're just dealing with wood destroying insect inspection. The buyer gets the inspection report back and they don't like the amount of treatment or the damage, they could void the contract automatically under the right to terminate. Once they start to negotiate with the seller and the seller agreed to do everything, then the contingency would be satisfied and removed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks, Marty.
You bet.
Any other questions for Marty before he moves on?
All right.
I think you're safe.
We're moving on. Okay, so now we have GCAR. And I've highlighted here, what I've done is I decided to pick a few points. GCAR just did a major overhaul of some of their documents, their forms back in July. The only adjustment for financing in October, and it hasn't come out yet, is they forgot to put in their conventional financing, FHA and VA, that the appraiser needs to be licensed in the jurisdiction. So just know that that's coming, all right? But what I wanted to do here for you guys is note that time is of the essence again, which means all of our dates are locked in and you got to remember to meet those dates. Price and financing is defined here in paragraph 3. And I provided all of this information here, and just so that you can see it, they also define the specified financing that ultimately the buyer must apply through the financing addenda. So we're going to look at that in just a second. But before I get to that, I just want to tell you all, I mean, this is crazy. I think back when I was doing loans, I may have done 2 or 3 assumptions. I think our company's done 8 assumptions since August 1st. And I have found that our contracts do not address assumptions appropriately. So we put together an addendum for assumptions that work for the MR contract, the GCAR contract, and the NVAR contract. So if you ever have, if you want to be talking about assumptions, or if you're having that conversation and you all would like to look at that addenda, I'm more than happy to share it with you, so you can share it with your agents and you can talk through that. But anyway, that's where that's defined. Wood destroying insects is still in the GCAR contract. So I'm pointing that out here. It doesn't need to be a separate inspection. And the seller agrees pursuant to this addendum. There is no limit on what they will pay in order to do repairs and or treat. So GCAR has not made any changes there like MR has. Financing application. This is a really important provision when it comes to you all as lenders. It says that the buyer must apply for the specified financing and make application. It also says that they have to also apply for insurance within 7 days of the date of ratification. That's really important in GCAR, because if it's after 7 days, they ultimately don't have a contingency. The 8th day, they don't. And if they switch lenders, okay, after the 7 days, that's an alternate lender under GCAR, and they've removed the contingency as well. So very important for you guys to remember that from a definition standpoint. I also put in here, I highlighted days because I know that's important to you. So for GCAR, days means calendar days unless otherwise specified in the contract. Oh, and you know what, Kate, I wanted to address something with you. The computation of days paragraph, you and I chatted about this yesterday, and I should have mentioned it when I was in the MR section. the computation of days paragraph does not address if the settlement date falls on a federal holiday or on the weekend. Actually, MR has the local board forms. So your GCAR forms from Montgomery County or your Prince George's County or Anne Arundel County, Howard County, you know what I'm talking about. All the counties, they're the ones that default as to what that would be. For Montgomery County, if it falls on the weekend or a federal holiday, it's the preceding business day. So if our settlement date falls on Saturday, you have to close by Friday. All right, that's for Montgomery County. I just wanted to point that out. But essentially, definitions here: days means calendar days unless otherwise specified. Business days is Monday through Friday, excluding federal holidays. For the purpose of computing days, the first day will be the day following delivery. Delivery is defined in the notices and delivery paragraph, which is exactly what I said to you. We sign off, we initial and sign the last thing. We have contract formation when we deliver the contract to the party that's waiting to receive whether or not you've accepted the terms of the offer, okay? And so then your contingencies start the day following that delivery. So if we ratify today, then our first day of our contingencies would be tomorrow. And then GCAR actually addresses if settlement date falls on Sunday, Saturday, that it's the prior business day, and then specified financing means the financing is set forth in the attached addendum. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like here. So for GCAR, you can see paragraph 1, the first and second trust combination is essentially your contingency. That's your specified financing. So if there is any change to this, which would be your loan amount, percentage of sales price, your amortization, okay, and then certainly GCAR has per year or market rate available. So really the interest rate doesn't matter, but if it's a fixed or an adjustable rate mortgage, any change to those boilerplate terms on a first and a second essentially needs to be, that would be alternate financing, which is defined in paragraph 3. And it says very clearly that the financing contingency shall not apply to any alternate financing. So if you guys, you know, and I'm just thinking about something that I see often with some of the second trust programs, like if you have an HPAP loan or something like that, where maybe you're not getting it from where it's not just a second trust from another bank or another source. I often see that this is left blank. Well, if your client's getting secondary financing, it's obligated to be in here. The fact that they're pursuing it, if it's not stated here, they're pursuing alternate financing, and ultimately they don't have a contingency. The way that the contingency works for the buyer in GCAR, and all of you got to understand this, is that if the buyer fails to deliver the conditional commitment by the deadline, okay, and the deadline is stated in the contingency itself in paragraph 4, the seller has the unilateral right to send notice voiding the contract. It's over. So when you're setting up, when you're doing your loan application, you're looking at the contract and you see the number of days that is being allowed, you have to be able to deliver that conditional commitment, because failure to do so, the buyer's out. They have no right to cure, no provision to do that. And I've seen it happen where agents have been in possession of your conditional commitment. They failed to deliver it to the other party. And then guess what? The seller gets a better offer and they go ahead and they send notice voiding the contract. So just remember that those dates are critically important for you guys in dealing with this. This is another important thing. Unlike MR and NVAR, GCAR has it as long as the buyer's diligently pursuing financing, as long as they essentially get the conditional commitment, they keep that, the financing contingency stays in place up and through the settlement date. And the seller just has the right to void the contract in 2 different spots. 1, by the financing deadline, and then 2, after the date of settlement. In either case, the buyer would receive back their earnest money deposit unless the seller can prove that they defaulted. And you'll see down there, the best way for the buyer to show that they weren't approved is through paragraph 6, the financing rejection. Okay, so GCAR really from a forms perspective, they want to keep deals together. You know, sometimes we get really close to closing. There's something that needs to happen at the last minute and funds are going to be delayed. They don't want the contractor, the buyer to be in breach or in default. They essentially want the parties to be able to work it out and still get to the settlement table. I put in the appraisal provisions because this is really different for GCAR. This was the main change. It used to be that GCAR did not have a built-in appraisal contingency in the conventional financing addendum, excuse me. So now they've modified this where you can check off the agents, this contract is or is not contingent until 6 p.m. 6 p.m. is the GCAR timeframe. And essentially from the date of ratification for the appraisal deadline. They also modified the term that the buyer, in the event of a low appraisal, if the appraisal comes in, everything's fine, there's nothing to be done. The buyer essentially just satisfies and removes the contingency. But if there is going to be a negotiation, they have a period to negotiate. And if they don't come to an agreement within that time frame, then the buyer has the last bite at the apple to either buy the property at the appraised value and pay the difference between the sales price, or ultimately void the contract if they want to by delivering notice to seller. That is a big change for GCAR because GCAR used to be an addendum of clauses A, and that's where the back and forth, the terms of negotiation were. And they just had this top provision in 7 where it says, if contract is contingent upon financing and such financing, specified financing is declined upon the appraisal, buyer will not be in default. That's all that they had in here, but they didn't have a terms and conditions of negotiation. And what they were trying to fix here really was the fact that a buyer, if they were negotiating under addendum of clauses A before this change took place, if the seller never responded to the buyer's request, the contract just became void. So they eliminated that and they redid it this way, which I think was a really good move. I also highlighted for you all the buyer default provisions. You know, if the buyer fails to lock in and rates go up, we've kind of had that environment, right? So I wanted you all to see that there are ways that the buyer could be in default. We refer to them as the 7 deadly sins as members of the forums committee and things like that. I guess that's fun for us. That, you know, it's kind of like we're losers regarding that, but that's what we call them. So take a look at those. There's different ways that ultimately a buyer could be in default. And I'll open it up to GCAR questions before tackling NVAR.
Marty,
Yeah,
quick
oh,
question.
Sure.
So in regards to homeowners insurance, is it apply or obtain within 7 days on the conventional?
It's just apply, just making an application.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Alex?
Marty, it's great to see you. Thank you. Regarding the contingency for financing being removed with the commitment and whatnot, it says the buyer will deliver it to the seller. So, of course, the agent is their representative. If a loan officer delivers that to the listing agent, is that acceptable, or do you really need the agent to do so?
Loan officers should never deliver a conditional commitment. Now, the beauty, Alex, is by delivering it under GCAR, it doesn't satisfy and remove the contingency. It does for NVAR. And so lenders are allowed to share general information like how's the loan going, how's things looking, but it has to be when someone's satisfying or removing a contingency, it needs to be the buyer or the agent that takes that act as their representative. Otherwise, it wouldn't essentially satisfy and remove the contingency.
Thanks, Marty.
Oh, you bet. Any other questions from the group? All right, then I'll move on. All right, NVAR. So NVAR's totally revamped their contract. And in order to deal with a number of different things, I currently serve on the forums committee for NVAR. And what we tried to do is put all of the information that the buyer and seller would need to negotiate up front and as close on the first page as possible. So you're going to see, if you're doing a loan in Virginia, you're going to want to look at all of this right here. It's front and center for you. It says price, down payment, what type of financing, total financing, and then it also has a seller subsidy, which obviously is a seller credit that would be provided there too. And then there's the financing contingency, whether or not this contract is contingent, that is addendum attached, or is not contingent. And then also an appraisal contingency. Is it contingent, addendum attached, or is not contingent? And then if it's not contingent, it has a provision where the seller will or will not provide access for appraisers. NVAR wanted to address the things when buyers are confident they're going to get their financing. They wanted to eliminate agents writing in, although this contract is not contingent on financing, the buyer is pursuing financing, seller agrees to give access to the lender's appraiser for appraisal purposes. So I say that to everybody here so that you understand that in MR and in GCAR, they need that language. Here, you don't need that language. You just need to check the appropriate box. Okay. And then there's representations here regarding whether or not the buyer will occupy the property or not occupy the property, which obviously is important when it comes to doing loans and things like that too. Settlement, if settlement date falls on Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then the settlement date will be the prior business day. So that's pretty consistent across all forms right now. And then you're going to see the wood destroying insect paragraph in a second, unless I forgot to highlight it. No, here it is. Wood destroying insects is here as well. And there's no limitation to the seller's expense regarding this. The one thing that is interesting with both GCAR and NVAR is if the wood destroying insect inspection report essentially addresses that it's dead insects, no treatment's required. If it's live infestation, then treatment is required. MR now doesn't make that distinction. So I think it's going to be freely negotiable as a separate inspection anyway. So it doesn't matter there. And then definitions, date of ratification is defined here as well. It's the same as obviously GCAR. Appraisal is defined here as well. And they have the Virginia licensed appraiser. GCAR is making that adjustment, you'll see in their October update. Days means calendar days unless otherwise specified. So that's important. And then all references, they actually have the Eastern time zone. GCAR hasn't put that back in. It's kind of interesting because we have had situations where something's done on the West Coast or something's done overseas. Do we have ratification? Did they meet the 6 p.m. deadline? You know, that stuff comes up from time to time. So NVAR addressed that here. And then they also have, for the purposes of time periods, the day following delivery. So that's consistent. But with NVAR, it's 9 p.m. rather than 11:59:59 for MR and 6 p.m. for GCAR. Seller subsidies defined here as to what it means. For you guys, just know it's a seller credit. And then also time is of the essence regarding the contract for NVAR as well. I think the critical difference with NVAR is that you have two forms of contingencies that everybody needs to be aware of. You have the one that has an automatic extension and the one that ultimately is automatic expiration. And you can see here, specified financing is defined very similarly to GCAR. First trust, second trust, alternative financing means essentially that anything that's different in paragraph 1 for financing, it's alternative, and the buyer needs the seller to execute a new financing addendum to essentially have the protection of the contingency. And then they also distinguish that if the buyer applies with another lender at any time during the contract time frame, it will not be considered an alternate lender. It won't remove the financing contingency like it will with GCAR. Actually, you can use an alternative lender. Not that, look, I want everybody to apply with you guys and go to the finish line with you guys, but every now and then they switch lenders. switching lenders as long as they apply for the specified financing is fine as it relates to NVAR. So paragraph 3, the finance contingency with the automatic extension, just real quickly, if the buyer doesn't deliver the conditional commitment by this time frame, the deadline, then it just continues. And the seller must deliver notice that the buyer has to remove or satisfy the contingency or void the contract, or the contingency is going to be removed. That's the way this financing contingency with automatic extension works. All right. The automatic, and then there's the appraisal contingency part of that, but the automatic expiration is the buyer just has X number of days from ratification to deliver a rejection letter. If the buyer doesn't deliver the rejection letter, then the buyer's contingency automatically expires and they have to go to settlement. Either way here, if the buyer's not ready to go to closing on the settlement date, the buyer is in default in Virginia, okay? And that's really important. That's a big distinction, certainly from GCAR, that the buyer is automatically in default, could lose their earnest money deposit, subject to other damages and things like that. The appraisal contingency, actually, I won't spend a lot of time with it because it looks just like GCAR's now, in that they have the appraisal provision, they have a negotiation period in the event of a low appraisal, and a buyer election period. I think GCAR took a look at this and realized that this probably is the way to go, and they essentially took this and added it to all of their loan programs, okay? And then they have the lender required repairs. And that's it for me in a nutshell. And I know I'm about 4 minutes over on my timing, but I'm open it up to NVAR questions or any general questions that you guys may have. Is there nothing? Kate, anything in the chat?
Nope, nothing in the chat.
All right, well, then if there's nothing, I want to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to go through the MR and the GCAR and NVAR contracts. If any of you would like us to share, we have some more in-depth things. If you wanted to share those with your agents or want to set up something where there's something more in-depth for people that you work with, that might be of value to your business, we're more than happy to do that and set up a time to go through with it. Otherwise, I want to thank the association for giving us an opportunity to speak today. And it's great to see so many friends here. And let's rock the fourth quarter together and do a lot of closings together.
Thank you so much, Marty. I'm going to have Danielle send out your contact information to everybody, along with what you went through, if that's okay. And just so everybody has that, as long as you signed up, you should get it. If you did not sign up, then you're going to want to email Danielle directly at info@mmbba.org.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. I know I learned a lot, so I'm sure a lot of other people did as well. We really, really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great day, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Have a great day, everyone.